Today I'm putting my scrap stash to work with a technique I've never actually tried without a die before. I've pulled together a handful of leftover patterned papers and cardstock scraps. I'm not measuring anything precisely, and I'm going to see whether I can turn them into not one, but two Sunburst cards. The first card follows a bright summer colour challenge, and the second takes the same basic idea in a completely different direction. So let's see what happens. I started by pulling together scraps in orange, coral, yellow, and blue tones inspired by a current colour challenge. I also found this gorgeous word print patterned paper in my stash and decided to use it as a full card front. With so many colours and patterns going on in the Sunburst itself, I didn't feel like the design needed a border. The background already adds plenty of interest, so I wanted to let it fill the entire card. For the Sunburst pieces, I simply grabbed my scraps and started cutting. These weren't measured or marked out beforehand. Most of the scraps were already rectangular shapes, so I just cut them at angles to create triangles and started playing with the arrangement. One of the things I enjoy about working with scraps is that it feels a little bit more experimental. Rather than worrying about perfection, I can move the pieces around until something feels balanced. Originally, I thought I'd cover most of the background, but as I played with the layout, I realized I wanted to keep some of the word print paper visible. That's when I decided to create a half Sunburst instead. If you're enjoying these scrap busting ideas, don't forget that my Card Making with Scraps issue 1 printable is currently available free to email subscribers. It's packed with ideas for looking at your scraps a little differently, and I'll leave the link in the description below. Once I was happy with the Sunburst arrangement, it was time to work out a focal point for the card. I knew I'd need something to cover the center where all of those triangle pieces met, so I started by layering a couple of rectangle shaped dies. They create a nice foundation for the focal cluster while neatly hiding all of those joins underneath. From there, I had to look through my stamp sets for something that suited the summery vacation feel of the card. I chose this little sun image and paper pierced the center using a patterned scrap. I actually tried it first on a yellow background, but it didn't stand out quite enough, so I switched to this orange patterned paper instead. I think the extra contrast really helped it pop. Then, because what's a vacation without taking lots of photos, I couldn't resist adding this little camera as well. Some of the paper pieced pieces on this little camera were tiny, so rather than trying to apply glue directly to them, I put a small amount of glue onto a scrap piece of paper and used my pick tool to pick up each piece, dipping it into the glue and then positioning it in place. It's a little fiddly, but I find it gives much more control when I'm working with such small pieces. And I loved the boldness of colour that little cardstock pieces can give when you're layering them over in this way. Once the camera was assembled, I felt like the card still needed a little something behind the sentiment. I wasn't exactly sure what, so I pulled out my bag of ribbon scraps and started auditioning a few options. In the end, I settled on this coral ribbon. It ties nicely in with the colours already in the card and adds a small pop of texture without competing with the Sunburst background. I also decided to restamp the sentiment in black. The original version blended into the background a little more than I wanted, and I felt the stronger contrast worked better with the dark script on the patterned paper behind it. With that done, it was time to commit to the Sunburst. I simply started gluing the pieces into place one at a time. There wasn't any measuring involved here, and I wasn't following a strict pattern. As I worked, I trimmed a few of the triangle points where they met at the center just to reduce some of the bulk. Since that area was always going to be covered by the focal panel, I wasn't too worried about making everything meet perfectly. One thing I noticed once the card was finished is that the gaps between the Sunburst rays weren't completely even. In some places, a little more of the background paper shows through, and in others, the pieces overlap slightly. But honestly, I think that's part of the charm of working this way. When you step back and look at the finished card, your eye is drawn to the overall burst of colour and movement rather than those tiny details. It's bold, fun, and a good reminder that a technique doesn't have to be perfectly measured to be effective. Once everything was stuck down, I turned the card over and trimmed away the excess around the edges. Because I used liquid glue, some of those overhanging pieces were a little sticky when I cut them back, but it's just part of the process. A quick trim, a quick wipe of the scissors, and everything was good to go again. With the design decisions made, it was time to bring everything together and start assembling the card. I wanted the focal cluster to sit up on dimensionals over the Sunburst, so I had to think a little bit more carefully about the order of the layers. I started by gluing down the areas where the Sunburst pieces overlapped, making sure everything underneath was secure while leaving the sections that would sit higher untouched so I could add dimensionals later. This is one of those parts of the process where planning just a little bit ahead makes a big difference to how smoothly everything comes together. So I played again with the sentiment. The pattern in the background has a dark brown script. I tried stamping the sentiment in a matching brown ink to see how it would look. It looked fine, but in the end I still preferred the version stamped in black and white. The cooler contrast felt like it balanced better with the warm oranges and yellows in the Sunburst. I also felt like it tied in nicely with the black line work in the other stamped images. Once that decision was made, I attached the ribbon to the back of the sentiment and played around with the positioning until it felt right. I always find this part a little bit instinctive, just shifting things slightly until the balance feels good. From there, I started layering the sun and camera elements, again being mindful of which pieces needed to be secured first because of the dimension layers underneath. It's really just a matter of working from the bottom up, trusting the order of assembly. I finished assembling the focal point and added it to the card using dimensionals, making sure it sat raised over the Sunburst layers. At this point, the card was finished, and I really liked it. But I left it sitting on my desk, and over the next day or so, I just kept coming back to it. Even while editing this video, I still think it's a lovely card, but there was just something about it that didn't quite sit right with me. After a bit of reflection, I realized it was the background panel behind the focal point. It has this beautiful soft gradient from yellows into blue, but the rest of the card's quite bold with strong colors and strong patterns and quite graphic elements, and that softer watercolored feel just felt slightly out of place against everything else. So I decided to change it. Because the focal cluster was already fully assembled and raised on dimensionals, I couldn't really take anything apart easily. So instead, I worked over the top of it. I cut a new rectangle from a soft, solid yellow cardstock and then die cut the frame shape from it, creating an inlaid look when I layered it all back over the existing piece. The only small complication was the little square details along the film strip border. To fix that, I die cut the frame again, popped out a few of those little squares, and used my pick tool to place them back into the openings with a tiny bit of glue. It was a little fiddly, but it meant I could keep the structure of the card while softening that background so it felt more cohesive overall. And in the end, it brought everything together in a way that felt much more balanced to me. But I'd love to know if you agree or not. With this first card made, I decided I wanted to explore this technique further, but in a slightly different direction. The first card had been fun and bold with lots of colour and pattern, but I started to feel like there was still potential in this idea to create something a little softer, something that felt a little closer to my usual style. I'd seen that the As You See It colour challenge featured Coastal Cabana as one of the key colours. It's a brilliant, rich aqua, but not one I reach for very often. So I pulled that out alongside with some pool party scraps, which really sits nicely as a lighter, softer variation of that same colour family. Originally, I thought I would cut everything into more uniform triangles and build the Sunburst from scratch. But when I found a cardstock front-sized piece of Coastal Cabana already in my stash, it just made more sense to use that as a base. Instead of overcomplicating it, I decided to place the pool party triangles directly onto this single background piece to create the Sunburst effect. I marked out a rough center point based on a sketch from Sunday Stamps where the focal elements sit over to the left third of the card and used that as the anchor point for my layout. From there, I just started cutting my pool party scraps into strips and then into triangles. I didn't measure anything precisely here, I simply eyeballed the lengths I needed so that they would comfortably reach the center point from the edge of the card. As I worked, I occasionally used that first piece that I cut as a guide to check the length of the next one, trimming as needed, but mostly it was just very relaxed, intuitive process. You can see the full Sunburst starting to come together on the Coastal Cabana background. Some pieces are slightly different in width or length, but I actually like that variation. It keeps the design feeling handmade and organic rather than overly structured or rigid, and it still achieves that soft, layered Sunburst effect I was aiming for. From here, I fast forwarded through the gluing process. Again, there's no measuring involved. I simply placed each triangle down by eye, working my way around the Sunburst. I did try to keep a bit of consistency with the orientation of the pieces. Since they were all cut from rectangles sliced diagonally, some naturally had that more obvious right angle, and I aimed to keep those all facing the same direction as I went around the design. There is a small section here where the pattern didn't quite line up the way I intended, but rather than lifting anything up and starting again, I simply just adjusted the placement as I continued. It's one of those things that disappears once the whole design's in place. After adding the final pieces and trimming a small extra section to complete the circle, I set the panel aside to dry, and at this point, the Sunburst almost had this feeling of like light shimmering through water, which made me think of a mermaid that I had in my stamp collection. So I stamped her out and set her aside while the background finished setting. I came back in and trimmed away the excess from the edges to clean everything up and bring it back to a neat rectangle. I then revisited the As You See It colour challenge and pulled together a few scraps in those coordinating tones to use for the mermaid. I used a paper piecing technique again for this focal image, which meant stamping the mermaid onto both solid and patterned paper scraps and building up the colour piece by piece in the main image. To build the scene behind her, I added a die-cut net from my Under the Sea framelit set. I also added a strip of ribbon in the same lime green tone as featured in the body, positioning both elements with tear and tape so that they would sit neatly behind the main panel. Because the sentiment overlaps both the mermaid panel and the background, I used a mix of flat adhesive and a small dimensional so it would sit evenly across the different layers. Once everything was assembled, I adhered the whole panel to a card base to finish the design. Looking back, I think a few small embellishments like pearls could have added a final touch of detail, but at the time I was really happy to leave it clean and let the colours and textures do the work. So that's both cards finished, two very different takes on the same simple sunburst technique using nothing but scrap paper and a bit of experimentation. While I was editing this video, something felt a little familiar, so I did a quick search through my old blog posts because I'd had a feeling I'd made a sunburst card before. And as it turns out, I had. I found these cards from several years back that also use a sunburst design, although these were created with a die I no longer own. Looking at them, the funny thing is I even used a similar sketch and same film die without realizing. Isn't it interesting how our style can hold over the years? If you enjoy this kind of scrap-friendly card making, I share more ideas over on my channel every week, so I'd love it if you subscribe so you don't miss the next project. And I also have a free Card Making with Scraps printable available for email subscribers throughout June. It's a little resource I put together to help spark ideas when you're not sure where to start, and you can grab that through the link in the description below.